what I've been asked to talk for 45 minutes about, and then we have a discussion. So yes, I mean, this is of course where I have to start, in Cairo, where, as you know, Aguéli lived for some of the most important years of his life. And I first exactly came across him in the 1990s when I myself was living in Cairo. And Aguéli had been living in Cairo and hanging out with Sufis and writing about Sufism, and I was living in Cairo and hanging out with Sufis and writing about Sufism. The main difference being that I cannot paint. Okay. However, he was interesting anyhow for me as a historian, but I felt this special connection, which means that to be in Sala today is actually a sort of dream for me. And I'm really, really happy to be here, and thank you very much for the invitation. What I'm going to do in this lecture is talk about the importance of Aguéli for international esotericism. So for that, I'm going to start off with a brief discussion of what do we mean by esotericism? What is esotericism? Because I'm assuming that most of you are more familiar with Aguéli and painting than you are with esotericism. There may be somebody here who will find all what I'm going to say about that very obvious, but I think we need to do that first. Then I want to talk about Aguéli's esotericism, where he got it from, what it was, and then I want to see what happened with it. So the impact we have to look at in two stages, because first there was the direct impact that Aguéli had on this French philosopher René Guénon, and then there is the impact that Guénon's esotericism, which draws on Aguéli, had on the world. And that is where President Trump will come into the discussion. But that's not until the end. So if we start off with this question of what do we mean by esotericism, one approach to this is purely etymological. And in Greek, eso refers to the interior or the inside, and exo refers to the exterior or the outside, which is why on Greek airliners it says exodus, not referring to the movement of the Jewish people, but where the emergency exit is. So on the basis of this etymological definition, the esoteric is the interior aspect of something, and the exoteric is the exterior aspect of something. So the esoteric, a text, especially a religious text, might be thought to have an exoteric meaning, which is the one which is obvious to everybody when you read it, and it might be thought also to have an esoteric meaning, which is somehow inherent in it, but can only be found in particular ways that is not obvious. This meaning is also applied not just to texts but also to religions. So some of the so-called mystery religions of the ancient world could be described as esoteric because their secrets were not available to normal people. You had to be initiated and become a Vestal virgin or something like that, and then you got to know these things. So here is the root meaning of esoteric, the interior aspect or possibly the secret aspect of something. Term was given a slightly different meaning in the early Enlightenment. And here we have John Toland, an English thinker of the early Enlightenment, who you have certainly not heard of, but he was friends with Leibniz, who you presumably have heard of. He wrote this book on Clidophorus, or of the exoteric and esoteric philosophy. And in those days, they explained in the title what it was all about, right? So that's to say the external and internal doctrine, just like I was saying, of the ancients. The one open and public, accommodated to popular prejudices and the religions established by law. The other, private and secret, wherein to the few capable and discreet was taught the real truth, stripped of all disguises. Now, this is expressed nicely and clearly a particular understanding of the relationship between the esoteric and the exoteric, which, precisely as it says, describes the religions that we can see, the official religions, what we get if we go to the Svenska Kyrkan, or whatever, yeah, Kyrkan, yes. Anyhow, that is exoteric. And it serves all sorts of political and social processes, and Marx had views on that. There is also, however, an esoteric internal truth which they're not telling people. Right? And as it says here, the esoteric is truth, and the exoteric is law. So here is an idea, a conception of the esoteric, which has been around for rather a long time. There's another understanding of the esoteric which one might connect with Neoplatonism. And I don't know, I mean, you're all familiar with Plato, but I don't know how much you're familiar with what happened afterwards, and whether the name Plotinus means anything to you. But if we went back to Renaissance Florence, for example, and said Plato or Plotinus, people would have said, oh, Plotinus, absolutely. That's a much more developed and advanced form of this philosophy. Nowadays, we've gone back to Plato, and we tend to stop there. And the so-called Neoplatonic philosophers at the end of antiquity are not paid much attention to. But actually, they were extremely important. And they were important also for Aguéli. So what I want to talk about next is precisely his understanding of esotericism, and this he picks up most of it when he is a young man. And I mean, Aguéli read everything. He read enormous amounts in many, many different languages. But I'm going to point to three especially important sources of his esotericism. And the first one is one of the, possibly the most famous Swedish esoteric philosopher. How people see this man and how people describe him varies a bit, and there isn't a consensus on this. But if you go back and read Swedenborg's works, you find that they are very Neoplatonic, and they are also very esoteric, both in the sense that he's identifying a true core inside Christianity, precisely as Toland was, and also, of course, in the sense that he spends quite a lot of time looking for the esoteric meaning, the secret internal meaning of biblical texts. When I say he's very Neoplatonic, I'm thinking here of an especial conception of the relationship between the human soul and the transcendent. And there's a particular understanding of that relationship and of what one can do as a result of that relationship with one's own individual soul in this life, which you find in Plotinus and the Neoplatonic philosophers, which you find echoed in Swedenborg, and which you find all over the place. And that's quite important. We'll be coming back to that. So anyhow, he read Swedenborg. We know that his mother read Swedenborg, and we also know that when he went to Stockholm, he was visiting the family of this priest of the so-called New Church, the Swedenborgian Church. And there's a possibility that Aguéli's relationship with this man's daughter had a certain romantic element to it. We don't know, but he apparently was visiting quite a lot. So that's where he gets his Swedenborgian esotericism from. The second important source he doesn't get to until he gets to Paris. And in Paris, he gets involved with he gets introduced to the Theosophical Society, which is the single most important new religious movement of the late 19th and early 20th century. A lot of people think that the so-called New Age is new. In fact, many of the ideas of the New Age can be found in her work. And Blavatsky and the Theosophical Society are behind so many things that they really deserve to be better known than they are. Blavatsky also accepts this idea, the Theosophists like this idea of the esoteric truth, and they like the idea that the exoteric religions are all in some ways related. And here we have to introduce the word perennialism. Perennialism is the idea, which you can find a bit in Tolland, and you can find it in Renaissance Florence and so forth, is the idea that there has been this esoteric truth since the very, very beginning. And all the religions that we know and are familiar with are built around this esoteric truth in some fashion. So that's the basic idea of perennialism. It's not quite the same as the expression of esotericism I was talking about, but it's related. Because you can see, if we've got an esoteric and an exoteric, well, you know, where does it all come from? The truth, there can only be one truth. The truth has got to have been there since the beginning. And then we have the different forms of, you know, Christian and Jewish and whatever come along later. So that is his second source. His third source is Muhyiddin ibn al-Arabi. And Ibn al-Arabi is the most important philosopher, theologian, philosopher, mystical writer, poet, whatever, of Sufism, of this strand within Islam which is built on ascetic practice and in some ways resembles the Christian monastic tradition. The big difference being that if you go into a monastery, you don't come out again, whereas if you're a Sufi, you just go into the monastery on Thursday evening and you come out again and go home to your family. And on Sunday, when the week starts, you start doing your ordinary job. Anyhow, Ibn Arabi is the central theologian, philosopher of this movement, and is also very, very Neoplatonic, surprise, surprise, because so many of these people are, and in some ways mysticism and Neoplatonism are often seem to be much the same thing. How did Aguéli encounter Ibn Arabi? Through this group of friends. And some of you, I'm sure, have seen this photograph before. I see you've got a copy of it hanging out there. But it's interesting to know who on earth these people actually were and what they were doing together for this photograph. And the answer is that, okay, here we have Aguéli, and here we have somebody who was extremely important for him when he was living in Cairo, an Italian called Enrico Insabato, who I'm describing here as a publisher. And he certainly was a publisher in that he published this journal, which we're going to come to in a second. But he was also working for the Italian government. And that is why we have in the photograph this guy, Muhammad Ali Alwi, who is an Egyptian who is working as a sort of secretary, but translator, secretary, part-time diplomat for the Italian embassy in Cairo, and is establishing relations between the Italian government and sort of major religious figures around the world whose loyalty might be transferred from the Ottoman government to the Italian government. And that's what this guy is doing here. He is the representative of the Sharif of Mecca, whose loyalties, as you know, were transferred away from the Ottoman government during the First World War, not to the Italians, but to the British, and one of the people who the British sent over was, of course, Lawrence of Arabia. So this is a sort of pre-run of the whole Lawrence of Arabia story. And not in this picture, unfortunately, is a third person who was the Sufi sheikh with whom Aguéli was most in contact and who introduced him to the work of Ibn Arabi, and they sat and they studied. Aguéli had very good Arabic. They sat and they studied it together and they worked their way through it. And then Aguéli starts writing about it in this newspaper. And this newspaper, as you can see, is actually a bilingual newspaper. In Italian, it's called Il Convito, and if you look at the Arabic side, you can just about see the T-O of Convito coming through from the other side. So it's published in Italian and in Arabic, and it's supported by the Italian government, and the object of the exercise is to promote Italy as a power which is sympathetic to old-fashioned traditional Islam, like that guy we saw in the early photograph for the Sharif of Mecca. And Aguéli is writing in this newspaper. He's writing mostly in Italian, and he's writing very often about Ibn Arabi. He's also writing about a few other topics. Here we have The Enemies of Islam, which is an article he wrote, which is the first recorded use of the word Islamophobia, or Islamophobia in this case, which seems to be, we don't know whether it's Aguéli's invention, but nobody has ever found an earlier use of that term. So he's writing about Ibn Arabi, and he's presenting him very much in Swedenborgian terms as the universally true, a version of the universally true, esoteric, etc., etc., etc. The other thing he does in this newspaper is he announces the foundation of a society for the study of the work of Ibn Arabi, which he intends to establish in the West. And he does sort of. Fine, so that's Aguéli's esotericism. Now we want to have a look at the impact of this And we look at this in two stages, and the first bit we need to look at is the impact on René Guénon, and the question that arises here is who in that case was René Guénon. The answer is that René Guénon was a sort of amateur philosopher in Paris who Aguéli met after the collapse of Il Convito, because there were some problems and the newspaper lost its funding, it collapsed, Insabato left Egypt, Aguéli had nothing much to do, lost his source of income as well, struggled on for a bit, gave up, went back to Paris and met Guénon. Guénon at this point is a young man of independent means. He's been playing around in all sorts of strange organizations, Masonic organizations, Theosophical organizations, and some strange thing called the Universal Gnostic Church that he and a few of his friends have invented. And he's also publishing this journal here, Gnose, the monthly journal devoted to esoteric and metaphysical studies. So that is who Guénon is, and Aguéli meets him, and he starts writing a series of articles in La Gnose, and in fact, La Gnose isn't a vastly successful journal, and by the time its last issues are written exclusively by Guénon and Aguéli. They've lost all their other contributors except for somebody who does a monthly horoscope, which is printed on the front page by then to try and boost the circulation slightly. So this is, a marginal journal that lasts for a couple of years and then vanishes. But in this journal, Aguéli's articles, some of which are translated in this new book, in this journal, Aguéli is writing similar things to what he has been writing before in El Convito, except this time he's writing them in French. He's very good at languages, as you know. The other thing he does in this period is he holds one meeting of this Society for the Study of Ibn al-Arabi. And all we know about this one meeting is one letter that we have a copy of that he writes to somebody or other in Egypt, and he says, yes, I held a meeting, it was very nice, it was attended by some French people who've got the point about Ibn Arabi and Islam, and one of them is called Abdul Wahid. We know later that Guénon became Abdul Wahid. So we know that Guénon attended that meeting, unless there was another Frenchman called Abdul Wahid at that time, which is highly improbable. So this is what happens. The impact of this we will come to in a second. But this is an incredibly important meeting, which only lasts for a couple of years. I mean, the first mention of Aguéli by Guénon is in 1910. The articles are published in 1911, 1912. Then the journal collapses, and Aguéli goes back to Egypt, and Guénon starts a new journal in 1928 after Aguéli's death, which is called Traditional Studies, and this is the journal around which he builds a major movement. Unlike the first one, the La Gnose, which collapsed after a couple of years, this one went on until the 1960s. And There is a publishing house was founded as well, and a bookshop which still exists in Paris today, even though this journal no longer exists in French. There's another replacement in French, 2 journals in English, 1 in Russian, etc., etc. So this one is much more successful, and this journal republishes all Aguéli's writings from Gnose. So this is where they finally get a wider audience sometime after his death. Guénon starts this journal in 1928. In 1930, he moves to Cairo, which Aguéli had presumably mentioned to him as a nice place, and becomes a Sufi, just like Aguéli had. So here we have Abdul Wahid Guénon, in a sense, the successor of Abdul Hadi Aguéli in Cairo. Guénon then dies in 1951, and the movement, as we will see, develops a lot after his death. So, those are the events. What impact did Aguéli have on all this? Here we have to look at what is this traditionalist philosophy that Guénon developed, that was developed in Études Traditionnelles. The journal that we've seen was also developed in, 10 books by Guénon and 30, 40 books by 4, 5, 6, 7 major collaborators who are developing this philosophy of traditionalism. So the first thing, one of the first elements in this is perennialism, which we saw came from, we saw it with Blavatsky and the Theosophists. The perennial truth, what these other people are calling the esoteric perennial truth, is what Guénon is calling the tradition. So the tradition in traditionalism, the tradition in this philosophy it develops, is the perennial esoteric truth. Now, where does Guénon get his perennialism from? We don't know. It's all over the place at that time, possibly through a movement associated with the Theosophical Society. But anyhow, he didn't get it from Aguéli, but when he met Aguéli, they would have agreed on that point. So Aguéli is not the source of Guénon's perennialism, but could have reinforced it. The second element is the esotericism. And that's the emphasis on tradition. Once again, it could have come from other places. Once again, Aguéli would have reinforced it. The next point is that when we are thinking about this tradition, this esoteric tradition, where do we find this in Islam, says Guénon? Now, this comes from Aguéli. We can see this in the articles that were published in Gnose, that initially when Guénon is beginning to think about where do we find esoteric truth, he is finding it in Taoism and he is finding it in the Vedanta. He has no interest in Islam or Sufism. And then along comes Aguéli, and his first article, yes, the esoteric truth in Islam is found in Sufism. Ibn Arabi mentioned him, didn't we? And the same as Vedanta. We have the same truth here. So Aguéli is the one who inserts Sufism into Guénon's traditionalism. And Guénon himself is initially more interested in the Taoism and the Vedanta, and that's what he writes about, mostly Vedanta, but in his own life, he winds up as a Sufi. And as we will see, the movement that he founds winds up based around Sufism, and that is pure Aguéli. That's Aguéli's contribution. There is another idea which is special to Guénon, and something I must say is that traditionalism is the collection of all these, is the sum of all these. Each of these you can find individually somewhere else. You have to put them all together to get traditionalism. And that's what Guénon does. Now, okay, he comes up, everybody's talking about esoteric truth in a certain milieu in Paris and places like that at this time. But Guénon comes up with the idea that if you want to pursue the esoteric path, you have to do so within the context of a valid exoteric tradition. So I can't just be esoteric, and I can't just follow the exoteric stuff. I've got to do both together. And this is a revolutionary idea in this esoteric field. Nobody else has said that before. This is pure Sufism. The only place that Guénon could possibly have got it from is Aguéli. Because this is the point people have been saying forever to Sufis, you know, you guys, you think you've got the direct line to God and you don't need to follow the rules like the rest of us. You know, aren't you a bit suspect? Shouldn't we lock you up as a public danger? To which the Sufis have been replying for 1,000 years now, no, you've got it all wrong. We follow the exoteric bit as well. We are real Muslims, honestly promise, don't lock us up. We do the esoteric stuff within the exoteric framework. Now, a minor point, if this were true, why have people been arguing about it for 1,000 years? That's another question. Right? But anyhow, that's what the Sufis have been saying, and this argument suddenly reappears in French from the pen of René Guénon, who's never had any contact with any Sufis except for Aguéli. Fairly obvious where it comes from then. Anti-Modernism. Now, this is something which turns out to be super important for the traditionalist movement. And this is something you don't find with Blavatsky and people like that. Blavatsky, you know, the future, everything is progress, we're getting to an age of science and wisdom and the world is going to be perfect. They're all in favor of progress. Guénon is not. Guénon says progress is an illusion. Guénon says modernity is a disaster. He says it's the Kali Yuga, the last and final age. And everything is inverted, values are inverted. If you go to a psychoanalyst, they are promising you truth and they will give you lies. If you go to the wrong sort of art exhibition, they're promising you beauty and they'll give you ugliness. Right? Now, where does this one come from? Less clear, but remember Il Convito? What were the Italians trying to make friends with? People like the Sharif of Mecca? Old-fashioned Muslims, not reformist Muslims. So there are a number of articles in Il Convito and Il Nedi in the Arabic version written by Aguéli, in which he is stressing the importance of the proper, real stuff, not this modern reformism stuff. So this idea, again, it is there in Aguéli. Aguéli never mentions Kali Yuga. He's not interested in that. He certainly never mentions inversion. But there is a certain anti-modernism in Aguéli, and this anti-modernism in Guénon is super, super, super important. Then the final thing that's important in Guénon's traditionalism is he gets very interested at one point in the question of the relationship between spiritual authority and temporal power. Who should be in charge of who? Should the state be in charge of religion, or does the authority of the state properly derive from the transcendent? Guénon said it has to derive from the transcendent. Aguéli had no interest in this. Guénon certainly does not get this from Aguéli. I've never seen anything by Aguéli where he's getting into these discussions. But what we're seeing then here is that quite a lot of traditionalism seems to come from Aguéli. Not all of it, but quite a lot of it. Good. So that is Aguéli's impact, direct impact on Guénon and thus on traditionalism. What happens next? After Guénon died in 51 in Cairo, where does the traditionalist movement go? Answer, it goes everywhere. You can find it in the early development of the Green movement. Schumacher's Small is Beautiful. Schumacher was a devoted reader of Guénon. You can find it, just to give you some couple of random places, you can find it in the way in which some of the exhibits are presented in this amazing museum of Islamic art in Doha. Quite how traditionalist ideas got there, I don't know, but they're totally clear when you read some of the descriptions. You can find a couple of Swedes, I don't know if any of you know these two, who are very much, or were rather, very much devoted readers of Guénon and of traditionalism. But most of all, at the beginning, you find it in a large Sufi order. And this Sufi order is initially put together by this Swiss guy, who is now dead, and currently it is being carried on by this Iranian guy who, since the revolution, has been a professor. He's now emeritus, he's quite old, in the United States. This is a global Sufi order consisting largely of well-placed intellectuals. And at one point, years ago, I just made a list of the people who belong to this order and ran through the library catalogues looking how many books they had published. Hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of books on all aspects of religion and sometimes art and religion and so forth over many, many years. So this is a very large movement deriving from Guénon. And it is primarily, in the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, it is primarily a religious movement, emphasizing an anti-modernist approach to religion, traditional religion. What is that? That is Sufism within the context of Orthodox Islam, Sunni Islam. So this is hundreds of people distributed all over the world who are more or less doing what Aguéli said they should. That was until the 90s. In the 90s, politics began to change. And this is where we get to President Trump. President Trump, how on earth did they elect President Trump, you wonder? Well, that is a complicated question, but part of the problem or responsibility, that was very negative, wasn't it? Part of the achievement was this guy Steve Bannon, who was Trump's campaign manager and saved the campaign, got him elected the first time, became the chief strategist in the White House for a while and got thrown out quite quickly, but then everybody gets thrown out of the Trump White House quite quickly. So who is this guy? Well, apart from anything else, he's a devoted reader of Guénon, is Bannon. And I just thought I'd mention a couple of other people who are probably less well known in Sweden than Bannon, but are also dedicated readers of Guénon, and this is where traditionalism goes political. The earliest one is Alexander Dugin, who is a Russian dissident, Soviet dissident, who becomes a sort of alternative philosopher and is very inspired by the anti-modernism of Guénon. Doesn't get interested in Sufism, comes to the conclusion that actually the Russian Orthodox Church has a core of esoteric truth, which is why he grows his beard, because he joins a section of the Old Believers, which he maintains as an esoteric path within Orthodoxy. He is super famous in the West, for some people at least, partly because you can say he is Putin's Rasputin, and that makes a really good headline. He is not actually Putin's Rasputin. But somebody in the Kremlin likes his ideas, and he got his relations with the Kremlin go up and down, but he's received a certain amount of, or at certain points in his career, a certain amount of support from the Kremlin to promote his political ideas, which are certainly based on Guénon's traditionalism. Other ideas have come in since then. This guy, Olavo de Carvalho, you have never heard of unless you are Brazilian. But if you are Brazilian, you have heard of him. And if you hadn't heard of him, when President Bolsonaro gave his acceptance speech, and on his desk, the table he was using for his acceptance speech, placed 4 books. The Bible, the Brazilian Constitution, Churchill's History of the Second World War, and Carvalho's book called The Minimum That You Need to Know So As Not to Be a Complete Idiot, which is a catchy title, right? Olavo, as he's known in Brazil, nowadays presents himself as a traditional Catholic, and the period in his life when for a few years he was a Sufi called Sidi Ibrahim is one that he can't deny it because it's really obvious. So if anybody mentions it, he just has to get really annoyed with them and accuse them of something else. But he is, of all these 3, he is probably, in his political ideas, the guy who is closest to Guénon's traditionalism. So, what have we discovered? We've discovered that Aguéli's esotericism is based on Swedenborg, and that he adds in theosophy, a bit of theosophy, and Ibn Arabi, and that his esotericism is expressed first in the Gnose and then in Études traditionnelles, which is where it gets into Guénon's traditionalist movement. We've discovered that if we look at Guénon's traditionalist movement, which is the one that matters in the end, we discover that some elements of it probably came from somewhere else, but Aguéli would have supported those, and here primarily the perennialism and the emphasis on esotericism. We discover that some ideas are purely Aguélian, couldn't have come from anywhere else. One of them is the whole emphasis on Sufism, and the other is this idea that the esoteric has to be within an exoteric framework. And we've got ideas which may or may not have come from Aguéli, and that's the Anti-Modernism. And then we have ideas which did not come from Aguéli, and that's spiritual authority. These guys are all into spiritual authority, by the way. Yeah, okay. So, clearly, through traditionalism, Aguéli's ideas have had an astonishing impact. Now, what would Aguéli have thought of President Trump? What I want to end with, I've spent a bit of time trying to work out what was going on there, because we all know Aguéli was an anarchist, right? Progressive, leftist, nice guy. Not a Republican. So what on earth happened? And the closest I've really come to an answer to that is something that Aguéli wrote with which I want to end this presentation. And here it is. He wrote this in 1911 in an article, short article, La Polarisation. The past implies tradition, habit, collectivity, in aesthetics, classicism, and style. In politics, conservatism. We agree, right? The future means emotion, initiative, and individuality. In art, romanticism. In politics, liberalism, at least in principle. He's an anarchist, remember, right? Individualism is always futuristic because secret and strictly personal aspirations always tend towards the future. Okay? That first part we expect, right? Now, what happens when he puts them together? The ideal tradition is that which develops individuality through all the means of ancient wisdom, that is to say, through the intellectual heritage of all humanity. So that is how Aguéli, at least on one occasion, tried to resolve the contradiction between tradition and modernity. And with those words of Aguéli in his birthplace. Oh, yes, okay, I was going to end. But if you're interested in any of this stuff, I can recommend 3 extremely good books. This one is about traditionalism. This one is coming out next year and is about Aguéli. And this one's got a bit of Aguéli in it. And that's the end of my presentation. So, what have I left out?
But please ask questions.
Yeah.
Here we have one. Mark.
Yeah, okay, good.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Thank you for your very interesting presentation. The 3 guys at the end, they are fascists. Well, please wait a minute. And I noticed you didn't mention Julius Evola.
No.
He's an eco-fascist. So, Barry, I would like to hear from you something about the very disturbing idea that there is some kind of a connection from Aguéli via René Guénon to eco-fascism and these fascists.
Okay.
Please.
Fine. One of the reasons I didn't use the word fascism is that it's a very difficult term to use. It is extremely pejorative, start off with, and pejorative terms tend to lose analytic value. Secondly, there's an awful lot of discussion in the literature, in the academic literature, about what on earth do we mean by fascism? And I once had to review a book which had 16 people having a discussion with each other about what do they mean by fascism. And basically, you know, the conclusion after reading 400 pages is they really didn't seem to be able to decide. All these people are described as fascist. As was Evola. Evola, of course, for those of you who don't know, was another reader of Guénon who ended up lecturing on race to the SS in 1942, which is a hard one to excuse. I'm going to start with Evola as far as the fascism is concerned. Evola always used to say he wasn't a fascist. He had never joined the fascist party, and he found Mussolini too left-wing. He was to the right of fascism. his impact on contemporary politics is profound, the far right. He is the number one text that everybody has to read. But, you know, I mean, he's certainly about as far right as one could possibly get. Whether that position is usefully described as fascism, I don't know. I think it is actually to the right of fascism. If you ask Dugin what he thinks about fascism, he will refer you to his writings on the subject. One of his more recent books is called The Fourth Political Theory, and he claims that the three big political theories of modernity were communism, we grew up in the Soviet Union, liberalism, we know about that, and fascism. He claims that they all failed. And he then proposes his own fourth political theory to solve the problem. So this is where, if somebody has written a long critique of fascism, which they distance themselves from, not in the sense of saying, you know, I'm nice, I'm not a fascist, but in the sense of saying, this one failed, let's try again. Yeah. I'm not sure that it's the appropriate. I mean, he's certainly pretty right. Carvalho, I would not really describe as fascist. Bolsonaro, I wouldn't describe as fascist either. There's a different political tradition that they come from. Bannon, he's pretty far right. But is this fascism? I don't know. So, that's my attempt to answer that question.
What about Julius Evola?
He was to the right of fascism. He thought fascism was left-wing. He thought that Mussolini's fascism had compromised with the bourgeoisie. It was insufficiently radical.
But his connection to Guénon?
The anti-modernist, what these guys, including Evola, I mean, Evola isn't contemporary, right, which is why he's not on this screen. But if we were to take the four major political figures in the traditionalist movement, we would have to put Evola up here. What do all four of them take from Guénon? The anti-modernism. Is Aguéli partly responsible for that? Yes, I'm afraid. The idea of the necessary spiritual authority over political power. They're all keen on that. That does not come from Evola. Sorry, that does not come from Aguéli. That's not Aguéli's fault. He's innocent of that one. What else do they take? Well, they're all interested in esoteric spirituality. Some of them are also interested in the exoteric framework. This guy is super keen on the Orthodox Church, and these two are super keen on the Catholics. That, to some extent, comes from Aguéli. Does this turn Aguéli into some sort of a fascist? No. But there is a paradox. There is this paradox. And that's why I gave us that little text to try and resolve that paradox. Because, you know, I mean, I've been reading Aguéli and thinking about him for many, many years now. And I have found this a bit troubling. And that's the way that I try to resolve it. I mean, of course, there's another approach to this question, which is to say that we have liberalism in the center. I myself disagree with Dugin. I don't think that we've got communism, fascism, liberalism like that. I think we've got liberalism and the other stuff. And sometimes the other stuff sort of goes round and joins. One follower of Evola's in the 1970s in Italy got in touch with the Red Brigades. because they were both trying to blow up liberalism. They were both trying to destroy the Italian state. They were both using terrorist techniques to do this. Don't we have more in common than separates us? This guy was briefly involved in an attempt to connect the post-Soviet far left and the post-Soviet far right. He was a member of a countercultural organization called the National Bolshevik Party, which aimed to combine, or claimed to combine, the best elements of National Socialism with the best elements of Bolshevism. Most of the members were punk rockers. It wasn't a serious political organization, but it made a certain sort of statement. So he was briefly a member of the Brazilian Communist Party, and I don't know about him. I can't think of anything equivalent for him. But I mean, there is an alternative approach. I mean, the alternative approach is to say that, frankly, Aguéli's politics were actually quite radical. Perhaps I shouldn't say it in Sala, but the number of people who managed to get arrested for terrorism twice for two completely separate political causes is not, there aren't that many people who get into that position. So Aguéli was into radical politics. Aguéli was not a solid defender of the liberal order. And arguably, once you move away from that, the destination is not guaranteed in advance. I wanted to stay with the nice stuff. Okay. Has anybody got an easier question, please? Yeah.
Maybe it's off the topic a little bit, but just I was wondering if you could say anything about his Sufi practices to an extent.
Yeah. We know nothing about Aguéli's practice, unfortunately. We have one. There was a French journalist who shared rooms with Aguéli for a bit in Cairo, and wrote, described him as dressing in white, living off nothing except bread and a bit of jam. But when he had some money in his pocket, he reverted to his Nordic habits, drinking spirits and eating ham, and hanging out with his native mistress. This is the only account we have of his spiritual practice. I don't know. I think that if you wanted to find ham in Cairo in 1910, there wasn't a lot of it about. And there was a bit of a shortage of native mistresses as well, I think. So I don't, my own instinct is that this French guy was making it up because it's, read nicely in journalists sometimes, yes. Beyond that, we know nothing. Normally, if you're going to be a super serious Sufi, you join a Sufi order and you follow your Sufi sheikh, but you also join a community. Right? Because we know, like the monastic tradition, religious life is very often most easily developed in community. Yes, okay, you can sit there in your cave or on top of your pillar or something like that, but that comes later. That's the final stage of it. But initially, you really belong to a community. Aguéli had his teacher, but there is no indication that he ever belonged to a Sufi community. And I think that if he had, we would know. Because if you do belong to a Sufi community, it's an important part of your identity. You tell everybody about it. So I think that he was more into the intellectual philosophical aspects of it, which makes some sort of sense from what we know about him. And he's been reading and reading and reading and reading, since he got his first copy out of the Sala Public Library, if it existed in those days, which it probably didn't. So yeah, I think he was an intellectual Sufi. Guénon himself was more of an intellectual Sufi. We don't really get the religious community element of it developing to some extent with these guys. And especially a couple of followers of his broke off in France and established Sufi orders in Paris, which were very much after the standard model that we find in the Arab world. Yeah. That was an easier question, thank you. Any others? 3 is a good number. In Islam, it's said that God likes an odd number.
I have a third question.
God will be happy with you.
Really easy one. When is the new book published?
The new book is published in April.
In April.
Yeah, and
We will really
yeah.
have to have it.
I mean, at the beginning of it, there's a discussion of the art, there's a discussion of the esotericism, the Sufism, the traditionalism. A lot of what I've said today is based on my chapter at the end of the book, and then after that, there are translations into English of half the things that are in here, newly translated from the French. So that's coming out in April. Because it's with an American academic publisher, it costs an insane amount of money, so you probably want to order it from your local library. Or wait for the paperback. Yeah, that might be better.
And we are very happy because we are bringing Ivan Aguéli out in the world again.
Yeah,
That's
yeah.
very nice.
And not as a fascist. Although that's a very trendy thing to be nowadays, it seems. Trump's visit to Sala, is this going to...
How is the international, so to say...
Yeah, reception, understanding. That's also something I write about a bit in my chapter in this book. Limited. In the first biographies of Guénon mentioned Aguéli, and nobody, at first you can see, nobody was quite clear who this guy was. And some people thought that he was Guénon's esoteric master. And then when they discovered he was a Swedish painter, they rather dropped that idea because that didn't really sound quite right. And he's rather been written out of Guénon's biography. I looked at a number of 15 or 20 different language versions of Guénon's biography in Wikipedia in different languages, and most of them don't even mention Aguéli. The Swedish one does, of course. But and that's one of the things that I think we need to do. For our understanding of traditionalism, we need to pay more attention to Aguéli. Yeah. Good. Okay. Thank you.